was thinking it'd be cool to help decrease the allostatic load of being diagnosed with mania and associated things. I'm trying to point out some of the, I don't know if I want to say positives, but things that are fascinating about the process of mania and what it means to me, and creating new memes through endomimetics. I feel like MAP consciousness is like climbing the entire spectrum of human consciousness, the whole scale, by David Hawkins, Dr. David Hawkins, the 1,000 point scale, numerous times in one lifetime. He says most people climb 5 points in one lifetime. A person that goes into MAP consciousness can actually go through the entire scale in like a day, and it's quite disorienting. But I think that's actually part of the point, is to disorient us from our ego consciousness and show us in a very extreme way that it's not really what is ruling the roost. Oftentimes I felt like when I get to some of the higher points on the scale, I then go through a process of going down to the very bottom, like shame, and it's very difficult to keep myself alive, protect myself from myself at that point, because it's so awful in its feeling. But it's part of me as a human being, for sure. And then when I'm in that state of shame, I'm feeling the shameful things I've done, or sometimes I feel like I did something I didn't do, in this life at least. I'm not sure where it's coming from. And then I climb back up again, and I can climb up pretty fast. But I also feel like when I climb too high on the scale, I need to go back down to the bottom, because, or at least down lower, because the society is at a different level, and it's hard to remain in the higher part of the scale while operating in this society. And I don't know if that's true, or maybe it's just that a person has access to the entire spectrum. So just because a person gets to a certain point doesn't mean they're immune to the lower spectrum. I feel like a person with MAP consciousness, they can map the whole scale of consciousness. So if I am exposed to too much of the lower part of the scale of consciousness, then I am that too. So, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's part of empathy. But that's the trouble, not having a very, very solid ego to block me from that. I go back into that place because that's the level that I'm perceiving at. And I'm just talking like if I see something that is sort of traumatizing within the system, I feel that, like I empathize with that. And that's part of the gift of it, because if I was able to just look at it and not see anything, then that would just be like any other person who's pretty much blind to what is going on out there. So it's a strength, and it's also sometimes difficult. And that could even have been what happened when I read that article, that just brings me down to a level of consciousness where I am in a way judging that article from a certain vantage point. But it's not the vantage point of, oh, infinite love and blah. It's a little bit lower. So that's one of the reasons why I never watch the news, because it's just awful. I drew another picture. This is like the current diagnosis of mania. This is sort of the story and everything. And now me with MAP consciousness and mania, it's like all this context and story and possibility and intertwining. So one can find oneself in lots of different places in this map of context, which I hope that we can co-create together. And it's about creating your own context. And I feel like as long as the context is heart-centered, it's context from that space of perceiving from 528 hertz. it's not going to hurt anybody. Because that intention is love, and that intention is infinite context and infinite possibilities, not this is how you should think about it, and shut your brain down now because I told you how you should think about it. And I think lack of euphoric sensation is lack of paying attention to the moment. So lack of euphoric sensation is not sensing that it's coming from the past. So we're not sensing that our own ego voice in our head is actually coming from the past because it's associated with the past images and memories. And by not paying attention and being present, we're not present to the sound or the euphoria of the 528 hertz. We're not paying attention to what we're actually seeing out there. We're not present with it. Because if we were, we would be really seeing it, which would prevent this past image voice thing from happening. And we wouldn't be recording and replaying that thing. So if we're actually seeing present, there's no need to record anything. I feel like map consciousness is to help remap the inner rules. So our inner rules are from our ego, which are our programmed morality and societal rules that we barely even notice that were programmed into us. And so map consciousness is part of the deprogramming. It connects us with those inner human dimensions, which are infinite, and we can experience the moment in infinite ways, and it's an infinite unfolding. And if we're in alignment with that, we don't need our little past memories to protect us. What are those really going to do? These little images in our head playing, what are they going to do? They're actually preventing us from being in alignment with how we are designed to unfold. If a flower just kept repeating the first few divisions of after the seed pops open, it would never flower. So each progressive second, it changes. It's something entirely new. And then it flowers at the end. If it just kept repeating a certain step, then it wouldn't become the flower. So we basically are like seeds that pop open, but we stay in that seed just popped open stage, and we never flower. Map consciousness is trying to change the rules of the inner road, our inner road maps. And part of that is to do with the spontaneous social behaviors. And a lot of it is to do with how, when we actually perceive for real in the present moment, we understand. And the rules almost change from moment to moment, but we understand. When the knower, the ego, is no longer present, we're actually able to understand. It's sort of like when somebody is describing something in order for you to see what they're saying. Well, if you look at something in the universe and you have your clear perceptual apparatus, you can see what the universe is saying. 528 hertz produces all this variation in nature, and we would be able to understand it. The ego is not the driver. Just because it's talking about past stuff, it's actually kind of in reverse. It puts us in reverse. And even if you think about the computer analogy and how there's software drivers, and that's what drives the computer, and you got to update your drivers. Well, the ego is a crappy driver. I was thinking about DNA viruses and how they insert their viral DNA into our DNA in order to use our DNA replication mechanisms in order to make more of itself. I think the ego is a virus that inserted itself into our consciousness, into the silence. It's a meme virus. And it uses our own consciousness, our own mind screen, to replicate itself. And it turns it into our own voice too. So that's sort of similar to how a DNA virus sticks its DNA into our DNA and we think it's our DNA. Well, the ego meme sticks its memes into our brain and then changes it into our voice. So we think that it actually has some kind of truth and value. And it uses our own mind screen to replicate itself. It keeps talking on and produces images on our mind screen when our mind screen is actually meant to be clear so it can actually receive the universe, receive the endo memes of the universe through our perception. But our perception is blocked by these ego memes, these me's all the time. That me process has very little to do with the whole entire universe. By having this meme ego virus, by having these memes and these messages and these things we record translated into our own voice, making us feel like they're true, and then they replicate and repeat, that changes our epigenetics, because we're thinking, say, like bad thoughts and low vibration thoughts, and it's going to actually change our genetic expression. In that way, these mimetics that have inserted themselves into our consciousness, and we take them to be ourselves talking about reality, when really they're old viruses using our consciousness, our mind space, our mind screen in order to replicate itself. And by having that voice going on at 741 hertz or 744 hertz, whatever, it's actually changing our water structure in our body, and it's changing our epigenetics, because these sounds, these words, have an effect on our genetic expression. And Dr. Bruce Lipton has done a ton of work on that. It's whatever you're perceiving is what changes you, because perception is what changes DNA. It has to actually be perceived, whether it's a signaling molecule or whether it's a vibration. There's vibration receptors on all of our cells, so everything we say in our head is received by our entire body, and it's changing our genetics to make us believe more that we are this separate being, this separate ego self. So basically, by receiving these thoughts and images and everything from society and repeating them and recording them in ourselves, it's actually changing our DNA, and it's likely maybe mutating our DNA. It could even be causing more than epigenetic changes. It could be causing genetic changes, and these could actually be heritable to the next generation. And if I think about that, and they could be stored in that way, possibly, then past stuff could actually be stored in future generations in an epimemetic way, changing genetic expression for the next generation. And I think there's something epigenetically to do with dopamine. So the ego is seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. Seeking pleasure is reward seeking, is dopamine. To me, we've all been turned into Pavlov's dog. So we have a pleasurable image, we start drooling. Painful image, we cower, and then we try to produce something pleasurable or take something pleasurable so we can again drool. Or we think about something that we anticipate being pleasurable so we can start drooling again. And the pain pleasure is to do with the ego. So the ego, the me, which is past images and memories, is related to dopamine. And we're all doped up on dopamine all the time. And this relates to what I talked about with oxytocin consciousness. I think that is the world-centric way. So goals and personal development are all to do with dopamine. We're all just those rats in a cage that would take a shock to get a hit of sugar. And that's kind of what the ego is. It shocks you with one image and then gives you a nice one, and shocks you with another one and gives you a nice one. And we think we're actually choosing these things. 528, which is love, which is joy, is beyond the duality of pleasure, pain. Pleasure is not love. And so the voice in our head, our ego, is telling us what we want for pleasure and pain, is making these supposed choices so we can choose something pleasurable and avoid pain. And I actually have this sense that that voice, the ego voice, those meme viruses, the memories that we've recorded, and those thoughts and images that we've stored up within ourselves and then translated into our own voice as meme viruses that use our consciousness to replicate itself, especially because it's in our own voice, so it's pretty convincing. Now that voice with those images is what brings about the whole dopamine thing. Pleasure, pain. I want this, I want that. I want this, I can't have it, pain. I want this, I can have it, I'll eat this because I can't have that. Pleasure, pain. Which is dopamine, which is just like, oh, that's good, I got some dopamine. Oh, sad, I'm losing my dopamine. And that's how we are, and that's sales and marketing too. And so if you think about it in terms of the memetics and the meme viruses in our own voice saying these things and saying them in order to get dopamine and get the dopamine back that we just lost because we had sort of a painful image. This voice in our head is related to that dopamine reflex. It's a reflex. It's just a mechanical reflex. And when you think about how that voice changes our DNA, I actually feel like that ego voice of our own hijacks our DNA epigenetically to create the dopamine. So the dopamine is part of the voice being satisfied or dissatisfied in terms of getting its little measly desires or not. And so we feel a lot of tension when we don't get our dopamine. I feel like part of it is when we get dissatisfied over time, if we're not getting our dopamine fix, we start to secrete cortisol, which is stress, which is like, where is my freaking dopamine? And it almost makes us feel like we're gonna die unless we don't get more dopamine. And since we're always doing this dopamine thing and we always need more and more and more to satisfy us, that's the hedonic adaptation that Jason Silva talks about. I feel like we've turned our brains into dopamine resistant organs. So this could be related to how Stephen Kotler talks about how there's 5 neurotransmitters involved in the flow state. Well, if we're always in ego consciousness, that is just a dopamine reflex. And since we're always needing more and more and more, we're becoming dopamine resistant in our brain, the equivalent of diabetes, where a person has sugar and too much sugar over time, so much sugar that the pancreas starts to down-regulate its receptors because it's being damaged by all the insulin that the pancreas is secreting in order to grab the sugar. So in the same way, if we're always needing more dopamine, which is what society says, become this, become that, become better, become faster, reach your goals, new goals, higher goals, what we're doing actually is destroying our brains because we're secreting so much dopamine and needing more and more because the brain is probably starting to down-regulate the receptors for dopamine on the brain because it's way too much. It's dopamine overloaded. And not only that, with the stress of maybe not achieving goals and the stress of daily life in general, that is damaging the hippocampus, which is what is needed in order for us to maintain awareness and not lack ecphoric sensation to the point where we start accumulating allostatic load or stress. And when that happens, the stress also attacks the hippocampus, and then the memories from the past and stuff start up more. And that could actually be one of the mechanisms by which so-called psychosis initiates, because it can stir up memories from the past as well as further past as well as collective unconscious and start feeding them to the brain, just like, say, somebody would be on a different substance where they might experience somebody else or some other form of being conscious or sentient. And then there's the fear of losing one's pleasure. So I feel like the ego is just, it's a voice that creates epigenetic changes towards creating dopamine and not creating dopamine. So it's just causing constant bursts of dopamine, which there's receptors for in the brain. And then we need more dopamine and more. And at a certain point, or it could depend on the individual, who knows, then a person becomes dopamine resistant, and then That could even be when someone's like, what is the point of life anymore? Because the ego dopamine isn't satisfying. But we've hijacked, those circuits have been hijacked. Those aren't our only dimensions as human beings. Our brains are being warped. I can only imagine that those areas of the brain with the dopamine circuits, which is probably the prefrontal cortex, is like all big and tangled up and a mess, and then the other areas of the brain are like atrophying and not being used. So thoughts are tied to pleasure, pain, and dopamine. So one of the ways perhaps to silence the mind a little bit would be to decouple from pleasure, pain. I also have a feeling that the dopamine shuts up thought temporarily. So it shuts up our voice very, very temporarily. So if we're feeling a painful thought, that's our voice, and it's a sensation in the body because it actually makes those molecules of emotion, which causes epigenetic changes, which probably increase the receptors for that emotion. So by emoting in that way, we're actually making ourselves more susceptible to emoting in that way. And actually, the movie What the Bleep Do We Know from a long time ago talks about how we're addicted to certain emotions. So we're actually going to purposely pick out the salient bits of our reality that's going to give us that emotional fix. So one thing we're addicted to is dopamine, and then another thing is a few different emotions that we've become addicted to. So we keep reacting to that in our reality. And when we decouple from that, then we can experience the inner human dimension of infinite possibilities, and we wouldn't become habituated to any one single emotion. If we're not recognizing things, if we're not recognizing, we're not producing the images again, which reinforce it in our body by recalling those images over and over. So the image we create on our mind screen, the thought we have, creates a mirror in terms of neurophysiology and biochemistry in our body. So our dopamine system has mainly been hijacked to get that voice to shut up. But it just keeps talking. It just needs something else and something else and something else. It's never going to end. So I feel like MAP consciousness isn't a meaningless brain disease. It's trying to restore the brain. It's like restart. It's trying to reset the circuits because our brain has been taken over by the dopamine circuit and our body has been taken over by whatever emotions we're addicted to. So we're just re-experiencing that all the time, and that makes us habituated to it, which almost makes us need more and more of that same emotion. So we're being led down a road of that same emotion because that's what we're picking out of reality. The brain has degenerated due to dopamine resistance. Normality, so-called normality, is a dopamine resistant brain. And since it's hijacked in that way, normality is a brain disease. And MAP consciousness comes in and breaks that apart and shows us the whole spectrum, like joy and love. And in that way, it's creating some of those circuits. Even though the state doesn't last very long, it's able to create the pattern of some of those other circuits like oxytocin and anandamide and who knows what else is trying to create some kind of variation. Because we can't all be dopamine robots seeking out our individual silly gratification. That's going to destroy the planet, and Gaia will not allow that. I can see so many ways that Gaia might take us out. So MAP is actually a solution. It's trying to save us from our dopamine hijacked ego meme virus consciousness. I was thinking that I could design EMAP, Effortless Manifestation Action Plan, or Embodied Mania Action Plan. I have a social purpose, not individual goals. Can we be playfully disorganized?